Wi-Fi. So,
Yeah.
oh well. Um, Technology,
We're going to get this done, bro.
Yeah, we are.
All right. Well, we're back. I appreciate you coming back in.
Yeah.
And we left off talking about Bryson. So we kind of talked about the person that you're working with, the individual, the athlete. Now, if you could share kind of what you guys have worked on in the last year, some of the swing mechanics stuff, that would be cool if you're willing to share that.
Yeah. So, I think the first iteration would be kind of organizing out his template as far as what he does as far as his golf swing in the, let's say, the structure of his arms, um, his pivot, kind of like his overall geometry, and specifically kind of making sure that, like, the big one is kind of lead arm.
Okay.
Lead arm is kind of a fickle one because if it goes too much into internal rotation on the lead arm at address, it kind of blocks range, and then that tends to move when the body, and it's kind of a complex conversation, but when the
No,
body,
let's have it.
well, if the kinetic chain of how the body's unloading isn't firing correctly, that's the first thing that goes.
We're
So
talking about from the into the takeaway backswing, or are we talking about
on the downswing.
on the
So like
downswing? Okay.
so like at address, if things start to fire together too much and the swing direction starts to get too zero,
Mm-hmm.
then this arm starts to at address start to go more and more this way, and that's just effectively to line the face up. So
Mm-hmm.
and then things get to zero, and then he starts to hit balls left. And then once that would occur, then he would start to influence more right bend to get the start line right. So,
Gotcha.
and that's kind of like the first puzzle. And from that point, the only other thing that was ever really discussed is like matching, the right, I would say just the right kinetics to his geometry. So in the earlier stint of last year, like we brought Scott Lennon, looked at, his pattern as far as how he produces force.
Mm-hmm.
And, and it was pretty expected what we saw, we were like,
What
okay,
did you
like,
see like
well,
specifically?
I mean, he has a massive vertical, right? Because he's unlike like a Rory McIlroy who has quite a bit of a horizontal shift.
Mm-hmm.
Both draw the ball, right? So
Yeah.
Rory has a very big medial horizontal shift off the ball, and not to get into the weeds, but like if you were a amateur player, that's a hard thing to do because Rory's very good at breaking that lateral force and still draw the ball. Where most people, if they did that, they'd wipe it. So um, and and they both have a big vertical. Bryson just has a lot. He's got more than everybody.
Like
And
both directions, would you say, or like 'cause he
yeah,
seems to push a lot in his trail
yeah,
set up in his backswing, right? Which
yeah. So,
creates some of that.
yeah. So like if you looked at him and against Rory, like Rory has
Mm-hmm.
more of a horizontal with his frontal, and then
Mm-hmm.
he just has a ton of frontal on the immediate, which makes him look centered. But he's just pushing so much force into his trail leg to keep him, centered, and then the drop, and then another big frontal plane torque.
Gotcha.
So, so that's like what's kind of under the hood. Obviously, the reason why we look at that stuff is, like we've said before, is like
Mm-hmm.
it's a correlation to feel, and then the magnitude that a player produces is, in my opinion, very, very important because that's how you understand what a player's feeling.
Right.
So that's kind of like the overall thing, and then somewhere along the lines of last year, prior to, I would say, really the equipment changes, like everything was pretty darn good.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like, okay, well, how do you hone this all in. And so on that end, it turns into like obviously the equipment, matching the
Yeah.
equipment to the
Well, what
whole system.
about like I want to know a little bit about how you change, like how do you get him back into shallowing the club or what? Like it sounds, because it's interesting to hear him talk about it, how he feels like he kind of pulls down with the
Hmm.
club, in transition, which I think is a
Yeah,
good thing. A lot of teachers out there would say, "Oh no, that doesn't happen. The force has to go. Something has to move the club downward in order
yeah,
for that
yeah,
club to shallow." Correct. So, like, how do you
yeah,
organize that? Like, because that's what kind of what I wanted to know is like, what happens when he gets off, right? Probably gets maybe
yeah,
a little bit out. Like you said, gets
yeah,
too zeroed out when he's hitting at his best. What are his path numbers, and how do you sort of what do you
yeah,
guys work on to say, okay, let's get back to this feel
yeah.
to
So
do it?
for his pattern, and I think like this, it's a worthy conversation
Yeah.
where, okay, if we backtrack and we'll get
Mm-hmm.
to your question here, but like, so is there an active shallowing of the club? Well, we could argue that separation of having the right separation is going to help influence that. That's
Mm-hmm.
one checkpoint. Not getting too open too early.
Right.
But then also on the other extent, like there are other patterns where you have players that, you know, you go like a Gordon Sargent type pattern who hyper rotation, hyper side bend, some interesting stuff with the arms and the levers without going down that rabbit hole,
Mm-hmm.
who would have less than maybe a Bryson would have. It doesn't mean that they're not applying that force. They are. It's just
Yeah.
not to the same magnitude. So as far as a feel, without actually pulling down on the handle, um, I think it kind of goes back to the fact of like Bryson loads his body and his trail arm and his lead arm, and has the wrist conditions to allow a player to actually actively do that.
Okay.
And I think that's the big thing for a lot of people to understand because, like, if you're super narrow and let's just say super narrow at the top, just
Mm-hmm.
check that box. For you to actively do something, you're probably going to have improper wrist conditions, arm conditions in order to hit out on it and do what he
Sure.
does. So, and that's just like I'm putting that little caveat in front of this. But now, as it pertains to him, because he has wrist angles that are not over deviating, by
Mm-hmm.
design, and
Because
it
of his
doesn't
grip
mean,
style, right? I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So he's eliminated a factor there, right?
Right.
So, or reduced it, not eliminated, it's reduced it.
Sure.
And so, in any event, so when he goes up and he goes down and left, somewhere around, he starts doing it around P3 to 3.5, somewhere in there, as he's finishing his windup.
Mm-hmm.
Then he does have this feel that he can start to rotate this arm and lower it, right? So he actually actively has rotation in the arm and lowers it. Now,
The lead arm. So
the lead arm,
audio
yeah,
listeners get it. Everybody's gonna have to get the video version on this one as well, which is
yeah,
gonna be good. Yeah.
yeah. So like the lead arm just basically rotating. It's happening through the rotation through the humerus,
Gotcha.
and then obviously then it goes into the supination and the lead wrist. So,
Mm-hmm.
but excuse me, most of that range of motion is through that lead arm. So, and because of his grip type, he doesn't have any ills of it ever going left. So, which is part of the design of it.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that's kind of the deal. And what's interesting is because of the amount of reactionary down that he produces, and that he didn't move too far to the right, right? He put a lot of force to the right, but it's pushing
Mm-hmm.
it back.
Yeah.
Then the reactionary force is a lot of frontal, which
Yeah. The
allows him to draw
cartwheel.
it. Yeah, allows him to
Yeah.
draw the ball every time.
So
So,
does the top of the swing, like, because he's a little bit he's a little crossed up, does that
mhm,
definitely help the
mhm,
timing of the center of mass of the club
yeah,
shallow with his
yeah,
pattern?
yeah, and being that he does it not through the lead wrist, increasing extension,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's helpful as well,
It's
right?
more his
Kind of
right
done,
shoulder, right?
yeah,
Adducting, and then
right.
yeah,
It's
there you
going
go.
like this, yeah.
There you go.
So,
Yeah. Cool.
which is actually the same as Jake Knapp, just different wrist angles.
We're gonna get to
So
Jake.
okay,
That's cool, Eden.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so that's what's interesting with the big hitters is the big hitters, um, they do that, and I mean, I'll just kind of jump ahead a little bit if you don't mind, but
Sure. No,
like
that's fine.
this is one of the issues with depth, right? Like trying to get depth.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sticky one, and I get a lot of amateur players that are kind of either they don't have enough depth or they have too much depth.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say too much depth, like can that happen? Of course, like it can. Um, but you're artificially pivoting and moving the hands in, and if that lead arm gets across the chest too early, then you have an adduction issue, right?
Right.
And then you fake the turn and it's going to affect your tilts. And then a lot of those players that do that start spinning open too early, and then you've lost
Interesting.
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So,
well, I was going to ask you because when we talked 4 or 5 years ago,
mhm,
and I know you're stack and tilt background from 100 years ago,
mhm,
where they would want that lead arm in
mhm.
sooner, right? Hand path in. You seem to have gone definitely more of a what I call a sort of a straight line hand path early, and then get depth with the pivot.
Correct.
Is that what
Yeah.
we're talking about? Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so yes. So on that point, and this is um, an interesting one because here's where I think this would be a good roundtable discussion maybe with
Yeah.
with Andy because I would assume if Andy was in this conversation, and I'm going to kind of be him for a minute,
Sure.
that let's just assume that we have a driver, and I'm going to go off, the O'Grady terms that the lead arm is in 40 degrees with a driver at
Mm-hmm.
P3. Okay, like, am I doing that by this at 3, or am I doing it with the trunk rotation? So I'm going to assume that it's going to be done more with a trunk rotation. So the average golfer, if they're thinking of just depth, they're probably doing it with their arm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the ideal situation, and I think we would come to this conclusion, that it would be done with the trunk rotation and then the arm would load from that point, right? That's kind
Gotcha.
of how I
Yeah.
would
So it's more of a
think it.
like a blend of both, would you say?
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
think if
it's
we're to
interesting
have,
because I teach. I mean, my members are mostly older demographic, which we
yeah,
have trouble getting the pelvis to move. I've had a lot of success with actually getting their hands in sooner,
sure, yeah,
right, to get that
yeah,
depth. I mean, not letting the right arm suck behind them. I still want
sure,
length in the right arm, but that's
yeah,
just a whole nother animal of like the player in front of you, right? But it seems like with your,
yeah,
because I was going through your Instagram, like there's a lot of similarities to the way the takeaways look very, very similar
yeah,
with the direction that the hands are moving.
yeah. So
So
like
continue.
maybe at P2 across the board, the butt end of the club or midpoint hands might be like 2 inches in from where
Right.
they started,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't be 4,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
As soon as that starts to occur, we run into some challenges with the pivot later potentially, and that's where a lot of players get. Yeah, I mean, you said it, trail arm issues like overflexion, trail elbow gets behind the body too early.
Mm-hmm.
Now the argument would be like, well, look at Scotty Scheffler, he does it, but Scotty also ships it out and then does whatever he's doing on the downswing. Can't really get into all of that, but he
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
stuff to
Yeah.
line it back up.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think if we were just looking at like a model, and which I think you can do that, I don't have no problem with that, or models.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a spectrum to that that needs to be kind of respected a little bit. So in long hitter patterns, you tend to see even Rory, like Rory's hands get
Yeah. More
thrown
out.
down the line, and
Yeah.
then
Kind
he
of.
pivots and drops it back.
Yep.
So, um, and can the average human being do that? Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Not
Maybe,
all of
maybe,
them.
maybe
My
not.
guys can't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So is that the
yeah,
width piece that you enjoy? Would you say
yeah,
getting width early in 2 to 3? Yeah.
yeah. And Tiger did the same thing. He kind of had
Mm-hmm.
to, right, when he was young,
Yeah.
because he weighed a buck 60, so he had to throw that out.
Hmm.
and then wind it up wide, and then he loaded it, crossed it, and then smashed it. So yeah, so that's kind of the deal on that.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. Before we get to Jake, talk about, because we talk about the oddities, right?
Hmm.
Like, what are some of the guys on tour that you think are sort of odd looking or sort of outliers, I guess?
Well, that's a great question because I never really look at it that way, to be honest. Um,
I just heard on the other podcast
wow.
so outliers, like some different like things that kind of move out of the spectrum or the model that you would like to
Well,
see, and then
so
how does that work?
yeah, well, I mean, I look at it on both sides. So, like, here's a good example. So, you look at Wyndham Clark's swing on, let's say, video, right? And you'd go,
Mm-hmm.
okay, very pleasing looking golf swing, right? So
Yeah,
everything looks really
gets
good.
a little in early. I mean, we
Yeah,
played. Me and Brian played a practice run with him on Tuesday at the Open, so I got
yeah,
I videoed him. Was kind of looking at it. It was a little
yeah,
different than I thought.
yeah, yeah. And he cuts everything and a
Tried,
lot.
yeah. He was actually drawing a lot more in that, which may be
Oh, really?
part of his issue. Yeah, I was kind of
Yeah,
looking because I know he hits cuts, and he was
yeah,
especially with his irons.
yeah.
I was like, maybe this is getting a little crossed up of what he's trying to do or what he's
Interesting.
seeing. Yeah, which is probably why I didn't play great. But
Huh.
yeah, so continue.
Yeah, that'd be like one side of the spectrum where like a player, from like my daily like observation of golf swings, somebody's on the other side of the spectrum.
Hmm.
Not many times do I get a guy that would like, oh, I'm going to cut it like that much based off a pattern that looks pretty in line. Like you look at it and you go, okay, like if he's just hitting balls and you weren't watching the golf ball, you go, oh,
Yeah,
he's going to hit it pretty straight.
yeah,
And then you watch him set up and hit, and you're like, well, that's a fade,
yeah.
and pretty big. So that's like one side of it. And then it's interesting, like on the other side of the spectrum, like I highly respect like Sunjay M's game. It's very sneaky, a lot of left
Mhm.
bend. Um, hits it very, very online. Doesn't smash it because his pattern doesn't allow it.
Mhm.
But very, 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 very straight. I mean, just kind of scary straight. You're like, oh, what's he going to do? And it's like, oh, it's straight.
Yeah,
I don't see a lot of guys
pretty
do that.
neutral. Everything looks pretty neutral
Yeah,
for what he does. And
yeah. You're like, you expect it to curve somewhere, and you're like, well, that ball's not even being touched by anything. So, yeah, I mean, I think across the board, you just see a lot of those things out there where, guys play different ball flights.
Mhm.
Some guys hit it a lot harder than you really would think. I like Denny McCarthy's actions pretty good.
Yeah,
It's gotten a lot better. I know he works with Brian. I think he's made a massive change in the last 3 years. Where he's always been a great putter, but he's kind of
yeah.
snuck into being a good ball striker.
Looks like looks like he's trying to hit it a little farther. I was just watching him.
Yeah,
He's playing
yeah,
again, good again this week. But man,
yeah,
he can make a lot of birdies. That guy's
yeah,
unbelievable.
yeah, and he's a good dude too. So don't
Yeah,
let
it seems like
that
it.
go to your head. Don't let that go to your head, Denny. But um,
That's awesome.
um, yeah. So I think every guy out there, you kind of look at some of their patterns and you go, okay, I can kind of see how that works. I think at the end of the day, it's like I said before, it's you can tell at major championship venues like who the guys are you're going to see at the end of the week,
Hmm.
and that's kind of the next phase of some of these younger guys coming up where they kind of get elected. I mean, I mentioned Gordon Sargent and a kid with a lot of speed, pleasing looking golf swing, kind of checks all the boxes. So the thing that's next to kind of witness is he going to be capable of holding the mantle,
Yeah.
um, and if that's the case, then he'll be dominant and he'll win majors. And that's kind of the thing that I try to look for a lot. And I think the thing that is interesting is without these guys making too many changes, like can they still keep what got them there and this perception and ability to get better? And this is like Victor's thing. Like the reason people give Victor a lot of grief about flipping coaches and all this other stuff. Is this is a
Yeah.
pursuit of getting better. And although does that take anything away from the player? I don't know. I mean, if the person's self-image is really good and they believe that it doesn't really matter what they do, then you have a Tiger Woods situation where they're like, "Hey, I can win anywhere and do anything."
Yeah,
So
it's a tough call. I mean, it's like
yeah,
Wyndham not having a coach, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's where I was thinking, like when I was watching him play, because I was sort of just checking him out, obviously, and
hmm
I'm like, that's obviously I've seen how he practices, like just with
hmm
the visuals, right, which is super cool.
yeah,
I think it's a great sort of
yeah,
side of it. Is if a coach was in his ear going, yeah, let's stop trying to work it both ways. It's
yeah,
like
yeah,
let's go ahead and stick with that with what we know that I call it the falling out
sure,
of bed pattern of what are
yeah,
you going to hit under pressure, and let's stop trying to work balls into left
yeah.
pins or whatever. And who knows? I don't know. I'm just completely guessing, but
Hey, I mean, and that goes back to the Victor thing because like Victor hits a fade every single time and
right.
only wants to cut it. And when he came out on tour, he was second in driving and first in approach. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to beat that, and you're only hitting it one way.
Yeah,
So that's and then he obviously wanted to hit it further and went to Jeff, and then you know then goes to Joe, and and just it's this pursuit piece, and I think having no fear in doing that is a good thing.
yeah.
But then, like, if it's not working, go somewhere else.
Well, it's got to make it easier. Like that's why I dig the way Bryson
hmm
approaches it, because I'm a big kind of one way guy, and even though I got
hmm
guys that want to work it, and you got to kind of adhere to the player, obviously, but
hmm
um, he's just trying to perfect one shot. I mean, it's like
yeah, yeah,
I think that's a good recipe to kind of build on, right? I mean, obviously, I'm
yeah,
sure he had to cut it, he could do it. You always say,
sure,
yeah, you need the information, right? And
yeah,
we can do a couple of those, like my guy Will McGirt, like he just wants to draw it. I love that.
yeah, yeah,
Like if that's kind of the same thing as if we get zeroed out, then we're going to
yeah,
struggle because the ball didn't curve
yeah,
enough. So
yeah,
it's like, those are the guys that are, I think, and not that they can't work it the other way, but I
sure.
just think it's such a
Oh
good
yeah,
way
I
to,
mean, yeah, I think the perception is that if you took any tour player and said, "Hey, cut it around a tree and a drawer," I mean, they're going to do it. Like Bryson can cut a ball if he wants.
of course.
Like on the range, generally after a range session, the last drive or three, he'll hit a cut just to
Yeah.
do it, and
Yeah.
then he'll toe one, and heel one, and then tee it.
That's the other cool thing is like the task oriented training that he does.
Yeah,
Did you give him that, or is that just something like he
no,
seems to be like it's such like a kid like
yeah, he's always
environment,
done that.
right?
Always
It's
done that.
like, yeah, I saw him on a YouTube thing where he was just talking about how he warms up or how he practices. Like, yeah, I just hit one on the toe, hit one on the heel. Feel like,
Yeah,
it's such a great way to train, especially sweet
yeah,
spot control.
yeah, and especially like now his driver that he has and his irons, they allow him to do it with even more control.
Mm-hmm.
That's the cool part. So like the
Yeah.
gearing effect is like it matches up to his speed.
Yeah. He's going to
So
change the game as far as equipment goes.
yeah,
If he
yeah, it's
continues to play well.
definitely heading that way for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah,
That's really,
yeah,
really good. So talk about your guy, Jake Knapp. He's obviously come up the
yeah,
last couple of years and done well.
yeah,
He's good friends with my guy, Brian Campbell. So it's, we talked to him a little bit at the Open.
yeah,
Seems like a really, really nice kid and obviously
yeah.
super
Very
talented.
cool.
Talk a little bit about your guys' process and what you're
Yeah, I
working with
mean,
him.
as of this year, I mean, there's a little bit of me allowing him to kind of get into the groove of being on tour. So we haven't had this like he has a stats guy, and we're kind of figuring out like we need in my viewpoint, it's just me. I don't like looking at a guy in a range and go, oh, you have this problem going on. I just think I might have done that 10 years ago. I might have done it 5 years ago. It could have been even 2 years ago, but I'm just not going to do that anymore. I'm going to look at a big picture of like a quarter or half a year and then see what really happens because I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to come from it from an emotional standpoint, specifically like a lot of players say, oh, I'm not hitting it good. And in reality, like, no, you're just aiming bad or something. Like we could pick
Yeah.
anything and
Yeah.
say that it's good or bad. But so with Jake, it's been like, okay, let's get as much data of tournament play and see what shows up on the other end. And so like one of the things that's interesting is like, I mean, obviously he's got endless speed. So is it better for him to hit a low cut out there with his driver at 185 ball speed, or is it better for him to go at 195 with full
Bomb it.
send?
Yeah.
And then how does that metrically, play? And then doesn't mean every shot has to be bombed, but okay, maybe two more bombs relative to whatever, and it kind
Right.
of sets you up to gain strokes.
It looked like he kind of went to that sort of squeeze fade a lot when he won, but he
Yeah,
was really struggling with the two wayer.
yeah,
Right. I'm
yeah.
sure you guys learned a
That's
lot from that.
Yeah, so that's the other issue is you start getting those metrics where he's inherently a draw player.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
yeah, so if you just left him alone, he'd just start drawing balls. Well, the problem is he starts aiming more and more, and then just starts hitting slingers. So
Mm.
um, that was kind of the conversation going into like the Torrey Pines and the called the Bob Hope, but the American Express.
Yeah.
Um, that was kind of like how do we get that closer to less of a big draw, and then how do you like hit like a hold fade, and how do you for him hit down on it means hit level and then hit a low shot, and then when he got to Torrey, it kind of fit him where he could just send it more and hit it one way,
Hmm.
and then New Mexico is kind of wide open, so he hit a lot of bombs, but then when you start hitting some of the lower cuts, you know
Yeah. You
the
started pulling it.
perseverance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the inherent issues. So,
Was that more of like a
um,
sequencing deal for him, like where the body and the arms got a little bit
yeah,
out of order?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so I think for him on that stage, that was the first thing. Then the next item that I'm kind of he doesn't even know this yet. So, Jake, if you watch, congratulations. But the next one's on kind of the approach. So, breaking the approach down into like three different segments. I already know his 125 to 140 and less, somewhere in there is pretty good. Um, and then we have kind of mid range, and then we have the approach from 225. Let's just say,
Hmm.
kind of seeing where that kind of falls in, and then how his strokes gained is around that. Because obviously short par fours, he's going to have a lot more flip wedges in there, and then par fives, the conversion rate should be pretty high. And then long par fours, he's probably going to hit a lot more mid irons in
Hmm.
um, than the other guys hitting longer clubs. So just kind of working through that. As far as swing is concerned, um, there's a couple little guiding lights with him where it's like, okay, like don't get, the club too far in. Don't get the alignment too far right. Those are like things that tend to happen.
In takeaway, too far in and
Yeah,
takeaway. Okay.
yeah. So his aim bias starts shifting right, and
Hmm.
then he starts obviously backing up and swinging more out on it. So like
Gotcha.
those little things.
Pretty
But
long
he's
backswing, right? Have you
Yeah,
ever mess with that, or you just kind of let it? I mean, obviously, it
nope,
has great
no,
flow to it for sure.
yeah. I because of his grip being strong,
Hmm.
I'm not because his left wrist has extension, and so that would be and like it's something where has it affected him negatively? And I haven't really seen that. I think
Sure.
it's gained more. I mean, like he was number one in driving, like I can't remember which tournament, a couple rounds where like for 2 rounds he was number one in driving. So I'm like,
Hmm.
okay, like if you take that away just because you want to hit a 100-yard wedge better, not a good idea. And like Fred Couples, same thing. Like he did okay. He's got a green jacket in the closet, so I think he's doing
Yeah.
okay. Um, but that lead wrist, because it's so strong, it needs to have wrist extension at the top. And I just figure if we get that thing wider and go in that direction, um, which is prevalent on tour, I would say with a lot of players, but
Hmm.
downstream, that means you have to change the grip at address, and then you have to do all these things that are just. But is that just vanity from a teacher standpoint? Yeah, it is. Because what got him there and got him to win his first year. I mean, I think 99% of the tour would take that. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
um, So that's kind of my thought on that. But yeah, I think the big thing I think with Jake to kind of understand is that this from now going forward, like he needs to realize like he's a perfect contender for majors. Like you couldn't ask for a better contender.
Hmm.
Somebody hits it far, has a good putting stroke, um, and is a good driver of the ball. Like if you just good driver, good putter, you're gonna be fine. Um, just practice hitting shots into greens, and you're gonna ring the bell.
Does he have a putting
Um,
coach, or is he just kind of
yeah.
on his
So
own?
no. So he still has Johnny Ortega, which is kind of like his
I
coach.
met him at the Open. Yeah, I didn't know
Yeah.
what part of his team.
Yeah. So he's been his coach since childhood, and so like my piece in it is just basically kind of like some technical swing stuff, TrackMan, and that. But overall, like,
Shout out to John because he listens to the show. He told me
yeah, he's a
that was
great,
really cool.
he's a great
Yeah.
guy. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I think with him, like with Jake and his whole group, it's like, he has a long-standing career when his mindset, keeps growing. Like
Hmm.
that's the big piece with him. It's like, okay, yeah, I belong out here. I'm good enough. And like we've done practice rounds with other players, and you're like, well, like you're way better than that guy. Like you have
Yeah.
no idea. Like
Yeah. The
way
eye
better.
test.
Yeah, it's pretty
He's
clear.
definitely got
So
that.
so yeah, I think it's going to be a bright future for him. And that's probably one of my only real jobs is just to enforce that. You know.
Yeah. Obviously, he's putting a
So
lot of work in the gym. That's what I was talking to Brian and like, what was he like? When you guys were coming up, and like he's gotten so much bigger.
mhm.
Brian said since college,
Yeah, yeah,
he's
and not
jacked.
like yeah, he's very strong. He's not bulky. Like
No,
he's
he's wiry, strong. Yeah.
yeah, he looks like an athlete.
Yep.
Which is huge, which is great. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. Brian's a. I've never met Brian. I've heard of Brian a bunch through obviously through Jake and
Hmm.
a lot of Southern California guys. They all played together, roomed together, and
Yeah.
um, I think also Marcus is another one he caddies on the Corn Ferry. But yeah, he if I remember correctly, does Brian hit a draw? Is
No,
that
it's
right?
fades. He's a
It fades.
fader. Yeah,
Okay.
he can like he started drawing a little bit more.
Okay.
But he went through like a injury on his left side wrist, sort of shoulder, neck. That's
Okay.
what knocked him off tour because he got on tour right out of college,
Right.
and
Right.
then he got hurt, lost his status, and then
Gotcha.
last 3 years when we've worked together, we've kind of got him. He's getting
Good.
healthy. It's really the biggest difference. I can't say that I've like
Yeah. Everybody tells me he's super talented. Also.
he really is. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got one of the strongest mindsets I've ever worked with. Just like
That's cool.
self
That.
belief is just unbelievable. Really good. And I mean,
Yeah.
he's gonna. I just said if he stays healthy, he'll be out there next year, and I think he'll be out there for the rest of his career. He's so good.
Good. Good.
Yeah.
Good. Good.
Okay, so let's transition a little bit into some swing stuff and
Hmm.
or tell me about hitbombs.com.
Oh yeah.
Like, can you
So
kind of go through like because coaching and also obviously some players listed like what are some of the we call the pillars of how do you hit it far and then talk about the orientation of the origination of that project.
yeah. So that project is a fun one because you know there's like how do you influence in a positive direction the industry and at the same time like kind of make it fun. So so Josh Koch was a player that I worked with, gosh, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and at the time he was probably 116 miles per hour, 6'3", physically looked like a beast, and had full blown driver yips. Like couldn't keep it on the mat. And when you look at his golf swing, you go, okay, like that looks really good.
Hmm.
You go, okay, like, but the only issue is like massive trigger delay down to the ball, face was going to go everywhere. And so after a lot of like work for like a year and a half, 2 years, like he basically changed his golf swing where it was a little more rotary, let's just call it that,
Mhm.
wider, started to get the face to line up, and it kind of unlocked speed. So he got to, and I remember the day because it was at the back of my range at El Dorado where he hit 190 ball speed.
Wow.
And then when he did it, he goes, "Well, I can go faster." And then at the end of the day, he was at 195. And then literally like a year later, he's over 200. He's like 215. And then we're in, was it 215? Yeah, it was something like that. Like a year later, it was like either 209 or 215. And we were with John Eisman in Virginia. And we were doing like a golf school there. And he just kept going faster and faster. He goes, "Well, I think I can do long drive." Like it just wasn't an issue.
Well,
And then
was it just the swing change, or what was? I mean,
yeah, well, it was the swing change that kind of unlocked his ability to keep going faster because
wow.
principally, and this is what kind of leads into it,
Yeah.
is
Sorry.
what, no, you're good. You're good. So around that time, like I would say, and I can't remember the date, but let's say it's around 2010, 2009, something like that. Like I was pretty stringent with mechanics. So like things were like the geometry of swing is all that really mattered and so on and so forth. And like it's still prevalent today, but
Yeah.
as I said before, like it's what's under the hood and how it's creating the geometry that kind of matters. And so when we crossed that bridge, it was eye-opening because then you're like, oh, okay, like originally when you got a swing catalyst, you're like, okay, cool, I don't know what this does, right? Oh, okay, there's a vertical, here's a horizontal, here's a torque. Okay, like, and everybody does it different, and there's no symbionts to it. Well, and then what occurred is you had coaches come in and say, well, this guy's rotary, this guy's vertical. And I'm like, okay, well, wait a minute. This guy's vertical and he's hooking it 40 yards left. So it's not even playable. Or this guy's rotary and he's slicing it. So,
Yeah.
like, we have to have some respect to geometry here. You can't just, like, spin and find it. So,
Love
in any
that.
event, if you think of it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
So,
I'm right on. I'm on the same page. Yeah. That's
so
just great.
yeah, so like what really occurred was, and this is, fully Josh is doing is like he just ramped up those things, which were like his kinetics essentially. Because one of the things that we realized is like, okay, like you're being super centered to the point where you took everything out of you. Now you have to add it in. So when you start adding in motion and then adding more of it and more of it. So let's just say from 1 to 2, getting as much force to the right as you can bear,
Hmm.
speed that sucker up, but be able to break it, like being able to break that force. Well, in 2D, it didn't look that different. Well, it did because he moved 2 inches more right, but in theory, like it didn't look that different.
With like his pelvis or like the
Just the whole
every
COG of the body.
everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Kind of like an
and then
Aberg looking like what he does, right?
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot faster.
Right.
So, and then being able to put that through the system allowed him obviously to keep doing that and ramping it, and then getting more into how the body's loading. So the body's actually creating a load to do this. And when I say load, it doesn't mean like I'm lifting something, but like
Hmm.
it's winding and then changing direction, and then allowing the system to lengthen and do that. So effectively, at some junction in there, we go, well, why don't we teach people how to do this? Because like you did it. And what's interesting is we can talk about both sides. Like we can talk about the geometry side of things, and then we
Hmm.
can talk about the speed. And obviously, this is weighted more to the speed, but it allows people not to go down the wrong road. Because if you just grasp for one aspect, which is like, I'm going to increase my horizontal force. Okay, fine. Well, if you do that, you just threw yourself into a wall 6 feet to the right of you, right? That's not
Yeah.
effective, and you can't find the bottom, and you can't play. But then this is the problem with the industry. The industry would say, like, okay, well, you need more horizontal force, so we're just going to publish that, right? But
Yeah.
then you just destroy the model. So, and that's a valid argument too.
Yes.
So, but so in any event, so that's kind of where this all kind of stemmed from. And, now we have, Martin Borgmeyer involved. We have like all these other long drive guys that are involved with it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of fun. And I think it helps kind of bridge the gap between the speed community and the golfing community. I think like, okay, like club head speed and long drive is kind of like a nuanced subsect of golf. It might not even be considered to most golfers as golf, but like that's a huge influence to golf. I mean, you look at Bryson, like he was in the World Long Drive contest.
Yeah.
So there's a good aspect to it. Now,
Brookshire is actually trying to play, right? It's like kind of like
yeah,
it overlaps
100%.
some,
Yeah,
right?
100%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really like where this all kind of started, and now it's gone into like, okay, now let's define like how would you train to do this?
Right.
So there's the training part of like your body, and there's more respect to that. It's not just like, oh, hire a trainer and deadlift, like that's not going to help you, So like understanding that this is a frontal plane and transverse movement. Okay, what is that going to do to your body if you just did sagittal movement all day long, right? So, which is like deadlifting and squatting,
Mm-hmm.
um, and unless you're like a freak of nature. So, yeah.
No specifics, or what are you going to get into? Like what? Like
Well,
I know it's tough. It's a broad subject. I didn't know if you had some
yeah.
of the
So like,
details of like how what do you? I mean, there's got to be some cause and effect of like you said, the three forces,
yeah.
and like
So
how do you
like,
put them together for that particular player? But
yeah.
I
I
got a
think,
smart to move now. Like it's like I'm going
yeah,
through that sort of
yeah. So
same
like,
idea.
if you were to influence, let's say, if you just looked at every player, you're like, okay, I want you to get. We have four phases in hit bombs. So let's just talk about the first phase. So like the
Perfect.
first phase is like after you get the setup stuff taken care of. It's how do we create movement in phase one? Okay, so the setup is static, and then phase one is like actually learning to move side to side,
Mm-hmm.
right? So developing the right trigger, understanding that, okay, the fastest players have some attributes. Every fast player has an upload. Okay, so that'd be one. Some players upload immediately, some players
Yeah.
upload a little later, but there
Yeah.
has to be
Yeah.
an upload.
So
So it's
that
like,
talk about that trigger piece because that's I think that's important. Like when we're looking
yeah,
at force plates, is we
yeah,
know the swing starts before the club moves, right? And how much we've seen
correct.
most players start
Yeah.
with the
And that's,
forward pressure, forward foot. Like, how do you teach that, or how do you monitor that?
yeah. So, and this is like something I do daily. So, like, I
Yeah.
had a kid yesterday who, has a really nice looking golf swing. And the first thing he did is his hands moved immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so then he overloaded his wrist. He went into too much left bend. And then because he was in too much left bend, overloaded his wrist, he went up from 3 to 4. So he started going up like really late. And then on the downswing, he can't do anything. So then he just pulls down on his arms because he doesn't have time to go down with his body.
Right.
So I'm looking at that going, okay, well, let me show you what this looks like, explain it. Okay, well, the first thing you have to do is realize that all this stuff up here is being conditioned by what's happening here. So at phase one, it would be understanding how to move the medial lateral force from lead to trail
Mm-hmm.
and let the center mass try to follow it, right? Now, it doesn't mean move the center mass to the right. It means let it try to follow it and then learn how to make it go faster and then break it. So it might
Gotcha.
mean that with a 7 iron, you've moved an inch right of center. Like it doesn't mean you've moved 4. Now, Justin James does. Okay. He's pretty good at creating speed, but
Yeah.
we're talking about golf right here. So,
Right. Yeah.
um,
So
and
how
that's
did
the
you train
fun.
that with that kid? Like were some like any drills or just
Yeah,
tell
so
them or what did
just
you do?
yeah, so I explained it to him, and then I said,
Mm-hmm.
"Look, here's your," and I had him kind of shift, learn to shift, learn to shift, and then because he was going to left bend too much and he was hinging too much, I think his left bend was at like 52 degrees, so it was way too much. So I said, "Look, you're going to feel at 42. You're going to take 10 degrees out, so you can maybe get to 45, 44."
Mm-hmm. What are you measuring
Look,
that with? What are you?
it's like sports box.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. That's fast. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
and And I think that's why I do it is like I can say, hey, you got too much, too little. Like
Hmm.
it's a really quick. I don't have to argue with you. That's the big one.
Right.
Student
Yep.
comes in, I'm like, okay, like this is too much, this is too little. There's the math.
What are
You're
you
good.
doing? Yep.
Yeah, I don't, we don't need to AMM you to death or anything. Like, although that'd be great, if I had all that and
Yeah.
I could have had a genie that put it on real quick for me, but
Yeah.
we're 2024, we don't need to.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, I just said, here's 42 degrees. And then because he shifted from left to right, it allowed him to throw the club back kind of down the line feeling and widen out his wrist angles. Now, the challenge for him is to push when he landed right and create torque. And then for him, it was not just boom, go into straight frontal plane and tilt. It was to allow a little bit more horizontal rotation.
A little more AP force.
Yeah, to get
Yeah.
him to get it back.
And push
So,
up a little bit, right? Yeah. Okay.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's kind of it. And then see
Yeah.
where that reacts. And then I know it's like, okay, instead of me, like in the past going like, hey, do this, do this, do this, just do that right, work on that for the time being, and then see
Mhm.
what reflects after that.
See if it changes
And
the
yeah,
transition and the stuff in the forward
yeah.
swing. Yeah.
And that's kind of the benefit of, having plates, really, because it's giving you a very good indicator on top of the fact that you can see the geometry of the swing, but you can see like when and where and how the player's pushing, and it's very easy for the student to go, oh yeah, I didn't know I was pushing into my heel that fast, or I didn't know
Hmm.
like or my center mass is going forward on the backswing or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's a good indicator. I actually had one player who, um, Jeffrey Kang,
Hmm.
which this was a really interesting one. Like, I he works with a bunch of people, so like, but I kind of work with him on and off for years, and he's got a aesthetically pleasing golf swing. And then for some reason, a couple of years ago, I saw it on TV, and it was really short. I go, well, that never looks like that on my range. Like it's always to the top.
Hmm.
He can swing 127 if he wants. And then I saw his swing. I go, that'll never make it to 127. That's like 112. So, but what it was interesting is like when he gets into competition, he would get short. I'm like, okay, well, let's try to figure out why. And it ends up is he lets out on the gas on the right foot. I have gas plates. So like he would go to P2, start to turn, and then he'd stop pushing on his right foot. So he would actually just kind of turn his body and try to make it look a certain way.
Hmm.
But he would stop, he'd let out on the gas, he would stop pushing down through the right, which would lengthen them out. And it was like, oh, okay, well, that's where that's coming from. So, like, do that in your routine, and then all of a sudden his swing got long.
Gotcha.
So, so I
Yeah.
think that's another good, like, instead of saying your swing is short, which is
Yeah.
darn obvious,
Yeah.
um, and his right leg still extended when it was short. It wasn't like it was a right leg visual, it was how he was pushing.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
Do you have a building now? Or are you still out just on the range
on the range, yeah. So I have like
with the plates?
with the plates, yeah. So I have
Nice.
like actually in my office right here, I have
Yeah.
the thing it sets in. I have the plates here, and then I have a thing underneath that I set everything so it doesn't move,
Hmm.
and it's firm. So yeah,
Cool.
yeah, yeah,
That's awesome. No, that's the
yeah.
good stuff, man. That's like really cool. All right.
So yeah, yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about before we close? Think
Um,
that
no, I
one.
think like I'm interested to see like where after this year where golf kind of heads, especially for us teachers. I think
Yes.
I think it's the best time ever. I think it's number one. I think a lot of people um, respectfully share ideas and information out there more than ever, and I think I think the other side of the coin is like how do we create better athletes? I think that's the next kind of phase with everything. It's
Sure.
like how do we condition them to become um, you know I think the pool also of golfers has gotten a lot bigger too. So I think that's another healthy thing. It's more of a worldwide phenomenon,
Hmm.
and the more the better. I just think and I know it's different where I live, where we've actually lost golf courses even during COVID, which is kind of wild.
Mm,
Everybody's mind's blown about that
yeah.
because it's California, and California, it's a little there. Everything needs to be a house or an apartment complex. So whereas everybody else are building golf courses,
Yeah.
but I think overall, I think the future of our side of the industry is looking pretty good. I don't know what the new thing is going to be as far as like measuring, because we have,
Yeah.
AI is hot right now, and I think, um, yeah, I'd be curious to see where things go.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
mean, I know they're talking about measuring the force on the grip, but I mean, it
yeah,
could be useful. But I mean, again, I think we sort of know what's going on, right? I mean, we can
yeah, yeah, I think
get a
so.
decent. I think we have enough to measure. I think to definitely help players. I think going back
Yeah,
to your point, it's like having that team around your athlete is huge, right? It's
yeah,
like, I don't know. Do you know Dr. Mike K?
I
Is
know
it in
of him, but I've never
Scottsdale?
met
Yeah,
him.
yeah. He's the guy my son just graduated and just turned pro and
Okay,
starting to work. Yeah, started working with him. And he's made just massive changes in his body,
nice.
not lifting, but just changing the physiology of what's going to help him with his golf
Yeah,
swing and what we're working on. So it's a nice synergy of that we have going. And I've also got him with Brian a little bit. He'll do some FaceTime stuff with us when he was having his injury issue, and he gave him some exercises and stuff. But I mean,
yeah,
it's great to have a guy like that that's going to look at it from a different lens than we
yeah,
do, right? From
yeah.
a physical side, and then it's nice to put that together. So I think that's really
And
important.
that's the athlete part. It's like,
Yeah,
obviously you can be born, and there's this part of your development where okay, you do gymnastics and you play other sports, and okay, that you are now an athlete. But like, if your thing is golf, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you
yeah,
develop that? And I think, um, obviously, take the genetics out a little bit. Like, I think you could still look at it from a different lens. This is just me observing. It's like, okay, well, that person there can be a good athlete because of the behavior in the gym is more of an athlete. You're more
hmm,
doing more athletic things instead of just lifting something heavy.
right.
Um, so, and that's not my space, but that's just my opinion. But yeah, I think that might be part of the future of it too. For sure.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of good guys out there, but I think they're getting better at sort of respecting our lane, and then I think the communication,
Yeah,
between the two is pretty massive. So
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
awesome, man. Well, I appreciate your time. As
Yeah,
always, we need to do this again.
yeah.
This
We
was
can do it anytime.
this
I
is
just have to make
incredible.
sure. I'm gonna put a Wi-Fi pack on my back so that
Yeah. Well, when
it
you're in the
works
car,
better.
I knew we were in trouble. Like, oh man, this is not going to go great. So, but I mean, we got some great content at the beginning that we'll put
Okay.
together. But this is fantastic. So let the listeners know and the coaches out there. I don't know who doesn't know you, but how they can find you on social or sign up for. You got a certification that we didn't go into as well. Are you still doing
Yep.
that? And then
Still doing
the
that.
bombs.com stuff. So like,
Yep. Yeah.
plug your stuff.
Just Dana Dahlquist, on, I guess, Instagram, Google, something like that. DanaDahlquistGolf.com. Also on the dark web. Just kidding.
I was gonna say
um,
I'll put all this in the show notes, obviously, but
okay.
yeah,
Yeah. It's
you
fun.
got like three
It's fun.
websites. I don't know which one is like you got
Yeah.
one the older one,
Yeah.
I think that you probably don't even use.
Yeah. I think that might still be that. I'm oblivious to all that stuff. I just stand on a range and teach golf, and then I'm
Uh,
like, oh, really? I didn't know that.
Unreal.
So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
appreciate your time and how humble
absolutely.
you are, and I know I've learned a ton from you from afar, and my goal is to be able to spend more time with guys like you in the future and continue to learn. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing and all your information is fantastic. So good luck to
And
your
you
players,
as
and
well. Thank you.
yeah, I appreciate it. All right, my
All right.
man. Take care. I'll
All right.
talk to you
You
soon.
too. Cheers, man.